This episode of Today on Wall Street. Mr. Zeidenberg, you are a partner at Arent Fox with a long and successful track record. While at the Department of Justice and later in private practice, you specialize in defending scientists, individuals, and companies in white-collar criminal matters involving contracting fraud, trade secret theft, economic espionage, export violations, and related offenses. We're so glad to have you here. Before we get started, Mr. Zeidenberg, can you please introduce yourself and your work to our audience a little bit, especially your representation of Chinese American scientists?
Well, I think your summary was pretty good. I had a long career at the Department of Justice, and then I've now been in private practice for a number of years. And starting in about 2015, I began sort of specializing in the representation of Chinese American scientists who've been accused of espionage-related offenses, so theft of trade secrets, theft of intellectual property, and then all of these charges related to grant fraud, which the government has been bringing against these scientists for allegations related to failure to disclose connections to Chinese universities or other institutions on grant funding. And so, it's been about 6 or 7 years now that I've been focusing almost exclusively on just that aspect of my practice.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. And, as you know, during the Trump administration, the Department of Justice launched a series of prosecutions against so-called rampant Chinese economic espionage, collectively known as the China Initiative. Many of our audience are Chinese American scientists and scholars and students, and they are quite concerned about the motivation and the effect and implication of China Initiative. I wonder if you can give us some background on the initiative. And now we're kind of 3 years into the launch of the program. What's your general assessment of the success versus failure of China Initiative?
I would say that the China Initiative has been a colossal failure. It was begun in late 2018, and it was designed supposedly to address the problem the Department of Justice identified as theft of intellectual property by the Chinese government. And it has gone badly off course. The China Initiative, instead of focusing on the theft of intellectual property, I think that they found when they began investigating that they really don't have many instances of that, and instead have been scouring the emails and records of these acclaimed scientists all over the country, Chinese American or Chinese descent, and looking for connections to Chinese universities, and then going back to the grant application and seeing for a failure to disclose something, some affiliation, and then claiming any failure to do so constitutes grant fraud. The thing that's crazy about this is that the grant work at issue is, in every case that I've had, completed satisfactorily. The work gets done, the money was properly spent, the money was properly used, the funding agency was entirely satisfied. But because back in, say, 2016, this individual was a member of a talent program in China, and that was not disclosed, they say, well, you committed fraud on us. But the fact is, back in 2016, no one was aware that this was a type of information that funding agencies cared about. In fact, they didn't care about it. Right. So they're sort of retroactively going back and with a new lens, looking at old conduct and deciding that this is now criminal. And what they're doing is victimizing, very hardworking, very successful scientists, and in many cases, ruining their careers so that the only place that they can work is to actually go back to China. And I have many clients who have now given up work at universities here in the U.S. and are working back in China now, which is, a perverse result of the China Initiative, which was meant to protect the scientific community from China. And now what we're doing is we're chasing our best scientists back to China. So I could just say the China initiative is a huge failure.
I see. And, there's one specific case that we've been following closely, Professor胡安明's case, which is one of the more recent high-profile China initiative cases, but it's not the only one. At least from what we read from media reports, it seems like, as you mentioned, it's mostly a case about disclosure lapses, if any, and minor paperwork errors, not actual intent to fraud. Would you say Professor Huan Ming's case is more prevalent across those China initiative prosecutions, or is his case just an outlier?
No, it's the prototypical case. I mean, that is the case that we're getting. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of these cases, and in every single case, it is simply what we would call paperwork errors, where they say, and in some cases, in fact, the disclosure is made in one part of the grant application, but not in another part, which, from our perspective, suggests that the scientists simply didn't understand what was being asked for, but they weren't attempting to hide anything from the government. If they were attempting to hide it, they wouldn't put the information in at all. So, I would say that the case in Tennessee, An Ming-hu, is a typical China initiative case, not an outlier at all.
I see. Well, thank you for that input. Despite the sort of the deterioration of U.S.-China relations during the Trump administration, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the history of Chinese Americans or Asian American scientists being victimized by the U.S. justice system actually predates the Trump administration. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the story of Professor Xiao Xing and Dr. Sherry Chen's cases, which you represented.
Well, those cases predated the actual China initiative, but they were very similar in many respects. And in Professor Xi's case from Temple University, the government did not understand the science. He was a physicist, is a physicist, and they accused him of sending some certain information that they said he wasn't entitled to send to a university he was collaborating with in China. But in fact, they simply did not understand the nature of the work that he sent versus the information that was supposedly protected. And, and that was because the FBI did not consult with the appropriate experts before they indicted him and arrested him and searched his home and did all these other things. So it had a huge impact. It was a very traumatic experience. And with Sherry Chen, she was a hydrologist at the National Weather Service. She was accused of sending information to China that wasn't supposed to be sent. And it was a similar situation where the government jumped the gun. They didn't vet the case properly. And, what happens when you incentivize bringing cases of a certain nature, in this case is involving Chinese scientists, the normal filters get taken off of DOJ. So normally prosecutors are very skeptical when agents bring them a white collar case, and they ask a lot of questions about, well, how do we prove this and how do we prove that and how do we prove that they knew that this was wrong? Mm-hmm. Because white collar cases almost always turn on the intent, and you can only tell intent by circumstantial evidence. And so prosecutors are normally very concerned about whether they can prove their case. And what I've seen again and again is that the normal filters and concerns go out the window if the agents are bringing them a case related to a Chinese American scientist. And they say, the normal questions and skepticism that they would bring to analyzing a case goes out the window.
I see. And it's also quite clear to me that not many scientists have the kind of resources, or legal knowledge to tackle those kind of cases. And I would say Professor Xi Xiaoxing is probably lucky in the sense that the spying charges against him were eventually dropped. But as Professor Xi Xiaoxing said himself, he and his family were still reeling from the trauma and stigma associated with the case. So, looking back, what do you think the prosecution could have done better to mitigate the devastating after effects of their actions? In this case, the charges were completely wrong, but even when the charges were correct.
Yeah, they could have come and just asked him and told them, we have concerns. Can you explain this? And he would have explained the whole thing to them.
Right.
They could have come to him and they could have said, we suspect that you may have violated the law. You should get an attorney and have him contact us. And then I could have contacted them and explained it all to them. But instead, the first time he heard about this was on a knock at the door at 6 o'clock in the morning with 15 armed FBI agents come into his home and search his home and put him in handcuffs in front of his children. So it would have been a very simple thing to simply ask questions first and arrest later rather than the other way around. Well, the fact is the U.S. government, and this is cross different administrations, clearly views China as a massive threat. And so whether you view it, I don't know that viewing it as discrimination is the best descriptor of this activity. These types of prosecutions, what I would say is that they have put such a high priority on prosecuting cases related to China that if you're Chinese American, then you have a target on your back. And if you are a member of a talent program, there's a giant target and a red flag and a flashing light over your head because the government's going to come looking for you. And so who is that group of people that work in China, work with China, and are members of talent programs? Those are Chinese Americans or people of ethnic Chinese descent. So it certainly has a disparate impact, and whether it's discriminatory or not, its effect is going to be fall almost entirely upon Chinese American scientists.
But how should the current administration and the Biden administration sort of balance the genuine need to tackle Chinese espionage versus the potential detrimental effect on the Chinese American scientist community? In other words, what do you see as the future of China initiative? Should it be abandoned, significantly revised, kept as is?
Well, I think it should be abandoned. And if not literally abandoned, it should just be refocused to where it's focused on what the harm it was originally designed to prevent. Remember, the harm it was designed to prevent was to focus and prosecute intellectual property theft and the theft of trade secrets. So the cases that are brought should focus on that, not on paperwork errors. And that is the crime that is supposedly so urgent. These grant fraud cases are not addressing the harm that the China Initiative is designed to prevent. So they should either just scrap the program or simply focus on cases that involve intellectual property theft. And my guess is the reason they don't want to do that is they'll be left with no cases because university professors are not working on classified information or proprietary information.
Right.
They are doing fundamental research and they publish the results. So the idea that China or anyone else would try and steal this information is kind of ludicrous because it's all public. So I think that the entire program is just badly conceived.
I see. Well, thank you for that information. Final question of the day. As I mentioned, many in our audience are Chinese American scientists, scholars, and students who are currently probably feeling a little discriminated against and potentially unfairly targeted in the current political climate, which is not very friendly to Chinese Americans living in the U.S. I wonder, as an attorney, what kind of protections or guardrails they can build for themselves.
It's difficult to go back in time. It's impossible to go back in time and disclose things that weren't disclosed before. And frankly, I would not retroactively make disclosures because that's just going to make you a subject of an investigation. That would just be putting yourself in the crosshairs. So what I would do going forward is to disclose everything on a going forward basis and be completely transparent with your activities in China. Make sure your department chair or your dean is aware of all your activities and that you have written approval for everything that you're doing. If you're traveling to China to give a lecture or a seminar, that it's okayed by the university. It's disclosed in your grant application on your bio sketch. And then if there are questions being raised about your activities, you really should consult with counsel because this can get very messy very fast. And in all too many cases that I have, I get contacted after they have been interviewed multiple times. And then the professor realizes, maybe maybe this is going to become an issue. That's oftentimes too late. So better to consult beforehand than to regret and say something or do something that makes things worse.
I see. Well, thank you so much for all the information, Mr. Zeidenberg. It has been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
感谢您来到由我李其 Lizzi 为您带来的今日华尔街频道。在看过节目之后，如果喜欢，请别忘了为节目点赞，也请您在留言区留下您对节目的见解和意见。如果您是频道会员的话，我们会在第一时间回复您的留言，解答您的疑问。另外，如果还没有订阅的话，请记得要订阅频道，并且打开订阅按钮旁边的小铃铛，这样您就可以在第一时间收到节目发布的最新信息了。再次感谢您观看今日华尔街频道，我是李琦，我们下次再会。